Hola, ¿qué tal? In this video we're going to revise Unit 8, El Racismo. As you know more than well, we will revise the topics, the grammar and the vocabulary. So, when it comes to the topic, we're going to look at racist and xenophobic attitudes in Spain yesterday and today, national and local measures against racism in Hispanic America, anti-racism legislation in the Spanish-speaking world, and for grammar point of view, we will revise past participles, orthographic verb changes, and mixed conditional. And finally, as usual, I'll give you some tips about vocabulary. Let's warm up with some grammar. In Spanish, past participles are verb forms that usually end in ado for year verbs or ido for year and ayer verbs. They're super versatile and show up in several different structures. Let's look at the main ways they're used. With verb haber to form perfect tense, as an adjective when we are describing, with the verb estar to describe a resulting state, in the passive voice with the verb ser, after the verbs tener, dejar, llevar, and in reduced clauses. Let's see some examples. First, when they're with the verb haber as a past participle. He ayudado a una ONG, habíamos terminado el proyecto, habrán llegado mañana. As an adjective, una puerta cerrada, unos documentos firmados, una ciudad destruida. With the estar, describing a state or result, la puerta está cerrada, el trabajo está terminado, las ventanas están abiertas. In the passive voice with ser, el libro fue escrito, la ciudad fue destruida, las leyes son aprobadas. With the result verbs like tener, dejar, llevar. I have, tengo hechos los deberes, I have done my homework, dejo preparado la comida, she or he left the meal prepared, lleva escritos 3 libros, she or he has written 3 books so far. Finally, we use them to kick off the short clauses, like terminada la reunión, once the meeting was over, o dicho esto, said that, o dada la situación, given the situation. Just remember the rule. If it's with haber, not agreement. For everything else, make it agree with noun. When we talk about radical changes and orthographic changes, it means 2 different things that happen to some verbs when they are conjugated. I'll break them down clearly. A radical change means the stem of the verb changes. I'm not repeating this because we revised them in the Unit 1. Orthographic changes happen to preserve pronunciation when endings are added. The sound stays the same, but the spelling changes. These usually appear in yaw forms or in the preterite. Let's see some examples for the yaw form. C becomes ku. To keep the hard k sound before an e, we swap the c. So, buscar becomes busqué. G becomes gu. Same logic here. To keep the g hard, we add a little u. Llegar becomes llegué. Z becomes C. This is just a Spanish spelling rule. Z can be next to E. So for empezar, we write empecé. G becomes J. Now with escoger, you only need that J in the present tense. Escojo. You've seen this before in the previous unit, so I'm not going to bore you with a full lecture. Just remember the formulas. First conditional is present tense, future tense. Second conditional is past subjunctive conditional. And third condition is past perfect, subjunctive, and perfect conditional. Keep those in the back of your mind as we go through today's lesson. So instead we are going to look into mixed conditionals. These are all about bridging the gap between back then and right now. So type 1 is if followed pluperfect subjunctive and conditional. Example, si la sociedad hubiera educado mejor a los jóvenes, habría más respeto hoy. the logic. A past lack of education is the reason we're seeing these social issues today. And type 2 is C plus imperfect subjunctive, conditional perfect. Example, si el sistema fuera más justo, muchos inmigrantes no habrían sufrido racismo. The logic, because the system is inherently unfair, a present state, it caused those past injuries. Time for the topics. Racist and xenophobic attitudes in Spain yesterday and today first. Let us look at the racism yesterday first. According to your textbook, I am going to focus on racism in the Middle Ages. We are therefore referring to the period roughly between the year 711 and the expulsion of Muslims and Jewish Spaniards in 1492. Let's begin. First, however, we need to clarify why the Muslims entered in the Iberian Peninsula. In very broad terms, around the year 711, Visigoth Spain descended into a kind of civil war in which two kings were disputing sovereignty over the country. One of these kings, in order to defeat his rival, asked for help for the Muslims of North Africa. They not only assisted him, but decided to conquer the peninsula and keep it for themselves, reaching their peak in 1031 and covering almost the entire Iberian Peninsula. That is how they entered. And now you may be wondering, what about Jews? Well, Jews were already here, although more arrived after the Muslim conquest. I shall continue. From 1031 onwards, the territories became fragmented and weaker, until in 1492 the Catholic monarchs decided to make Spain an entirely Catholic country. But they were good people, so they gave Jews and Muslims two options: either convert to Catholicism or leave. But what happened during those 800 years in which they all live in the same territory? Well, the idea that medieval Spain enjoyed constant peaceful coexistence between Catholics, Muslims, and Jews until 1492 is an oversimplified myth. Let's see why. The truth is there were long periods of cooperation and relative tolerance, but also inequality, conflict, and violence at the same time. First, it's important to understand that there was no tolerance in the modern sense. Today, when we talk about tolerance, we usually mean religious freedom and legal equality. But in the Middle Ages, tolerance mostly meant that minorities were allowed to exist, not that they were equal. For example, in Muslim territories, Christians and Jews were allowed to practice their religion, keep their own judges for internal matters, maintain churches and synagogues, although with restrictions, and they could trade and own property. But there were also important limitations. Non-Muslims had to pay special taxes. They couldn't hold certain positions of authority over Muslims. There were restrictions on building new places of worship or trying to convert others, and in some cases their legal testimony carried less weight than that of a Muslim. On the other side, in the Christian kingdoms, Muslim and Jews were also tolerated as minority communities, but again, they were subordinate groups. They could practice their religion, live in their own quarters like Jewish or Muslim districts, juderias or morerias, maintain a degree of internal autonomy, and participate in areas like crafts, trade, and finance. But they also faced restrictions, special taxes, distinctive clothing in certain periods, and they were especially vulnerable during time of crisis, including pogroms and pressure to convert. So a lot depended on the political situation. During periods of peace and economic stability, rulers were generally more pragmatic and tolerant. But during crises, wars, famines, instability, persecution usually increased. Therefore, we can say that the Catholic monarchs didn't destroy an idyllic coexistence. What they really did was push existing trends of religious homogenization to their conclusion. At the time, across much of Europe, diversity was often seen as a source of instability, and heresy was considered a political as well as a religious threat. The expulsion of the Muslim and Jews were extreme measures, yes, but they didn't arise out of nowhere. And what is happening today in 2026? Before beginning, I must point out that this information is based on a 2024 study, as there is no more recent one, involving a limited number of people from different ethnic groups in Spain. Let's begin. First thing first, what are the ethnic groups in Spain? Native American, Arab North African, Gypsy, White Latin American, Afro-descendant Latin American, White Asian, mainly Chinese, Black African, Eastern European White, and in relatively small numbers compared to other groups, Central South Asian, people from India, Pakistan, but they are very, very small groups. Right, let's look at who's actually facing the most discrimination today. If we put this on a scale of 1 to 10, the data give us a pretty clear and a fairly grim picture. First off, the Gypsy communities consistently face the highest level of discrimination. Then, African and Afro-descendant populations who are dealing with similarly high levels of systematic bias. On the other hand, who's experiencing the least amount of racism and xenophobia? Well, generally that tends to be white Latin Americans, Eastern Europeans, and the Chinese community. When it comes to seeing a doctor using the NHS style services in Spain, the experience isn't the same for everyone. Afro-descendant Latin Americans actually report the highest level of discrimination here. Just behind them, still seeing above average levels, are Native Americans, Black Africans, and Arab groups. Interestingly, the Gypsy community reports facing this about half as much as those groups do. In schools and colleges, it's a different story. Native American and Afro-descendant groups report the most discrimination. Just below them, but still above the national average, are Arab and Gypsy populations. Further down, but close to the average, you'll find Black Africans and Central South Asians. The ones reporting the least trouble in education are Chinese, white Eastern Europeans, and white Latin Americans. When it comes to dealing with the council or government paperwork, most immigrants actually say they're treated properly. However, white Eastern Europeans feel the most hard done by here. Why? This seems to hit the older a lot more, around the age of 40, partly because language barriers. These are followed by Afro-descendants and Gypsies. On the other hand, white Latin Americans use these services the most and report the least amount of bias. There appears to have been an increase in unjustified requests for identity documents on the street. However, this is not a new phenomenon. When I was a teenager in the 90s, it was common for police to request identification at random and without hostility under the law of the protection of public safety, today La Ley Mordaza. Anyway, it also appears that such checks are more frequently directed at Black Africans, followed by Gypsies and Afro-descendants. But again, this is not a new development. trying to find a flat is where it gets really difficult for some. Afro-descendant, Arab, and Gypsy populations report the most discrimination when trying to rent. It's usually down to landlords having prejudice about people not being financially stable or not looking after the property. Even once they're in, these groups often face more grief from neighbors or get the blame when things go wrong in the area. Finally, looking at jobs. The Gypsy community has the highest unemployment rate, followed by Afro-descendant Latin Americans and Arabs. At the opposite end of the scale, with the highest employment rates, is the Chinese community. The low unemployment rate among Chinese immigrants in Spain is mainly due to the strong work ethic, a high rate of family entrepreneurship, mutual collaboration with the community, and a rapid ability to adapt to economic changes. It is worth to mention that in 2021 and 2022, COVID-19 became a new pretext for the increase in anti-Gypsy discourse online and on social media, linking Gypsy people with the spread of the virus and no compliance with health measures, thereby generating hatred and discrimination. So, how does discrimination actually show up in real life? Well, the most common thing people report isn't always some big confrontation. It's the hostile looks. And who gets the most grief in shops? For example, the data shows that gypsies get the worst of it when it comes to those dodgy looks. Right behind them are Black Africans, Afro-descendant Latin Americans, and Arabs. It's the exact same groups who are copying the most grief on the street too. We're talking about actual verbal abuse and insults. These mentioned groups are reporting the highest levels of being shouted at or harassed in public spaces. But of course, occasionally, not always. But there is one bit of less bad news though. Compared to back in 2020, fewer people are reporting being flat out barred from entering nightclubs, pubs, or other spots. It still happens, obviously, but the trend of being bounced at the door just for your background seems to be heading down a bit. Okay, let's talk now about the national and local measures against racism in Hispanic America. But let's start by looking at why there is such great racial and ethnic diversity in Hispanic America. It's mainly due to the union between Spanish colonists and local women, which created a multiracial society. There is no single number of races due to the complexity of the mixing between indigenous people, Spaniards, Africans, and to a lesser extent, Asians. The ethnic composition is based on predominant mixed groups rather than strict racial divisions. This pattern led to the characterization of Hispanic America as a pigmentocracia in Spanish, where individuals with lighter skin tones are predominantly at the top of the social hierarchy and those with darker skin are at the bottom. But let's see this in more detail. First, let's talk about educational equality. Across Hispanic America, your ethnic background still plays a huge role in how far you get in school. White populations are far more likely to finish university, while indigenous and Afro-descendant communities are often stuck with the least amount of schooling. This gap is most persistent for indigenous people, especially in places like Guatemala and Bolivia, where a huge part of the population still lacks access to higher education. Then there's the wealth gap. Income in Latin America essentially mirrors the classroom. On average, white and light-skinned individuals earn significantly more per household, whereas indigenous and Afro-descendant populations are still facing the lowest earnings in the region. The same logic applies to the workplace. Professional and high-status careers are disproportionately filled by white or lighter-skinned individuals. Meanwhile, indigenous and Afro-descendant communities are much more likely to be found in manual or informal work, where there's often less security and lower pay. Finally, anti-racism legislation in the Spanish-speaking world. So, what's actually being done? Across Hispanic America, some pretty bold anti-racist measures are taking root to give historically marginalized groups more power and visibility. First up is constitutional recognition. Countries like Mexico, Colombia, and Bolivia have taken a massive step by writing multiculturalism and the rights of the indigenous and Afro-descendant people directly into their constitutions. Next is affirmative action. Many countries are now using racial quotas in universities and government roles to bridge those long-standing gaps in education and employment. It's a direct attempt to create a level playing field. There is also a massive surge in Afro-descendant movements. Networks like Dale Más Afro connect roughly 200 different organizations across the region. They're doing the heavy lifting to make sure Afro-descendant voices are actually heard in the political arena. There is a really interesting focus on language regulation. Different collectives are working hard to strip out racist terms and challenge the kind of casual racism you often see in the media or in public. Finally, research and activism are joining forces. Projects like La Pora study anti-racist practice in countries such as Colombia, Ecuador, and Mexico, highlighting a growing regional interest in dismantling post-racial myths and tackling system racism. Okay, enough. Let's move on to the vocabulary. Don't disconnect yet. Almost there. I'm going to repeat what I say in every unit. The vocabulary I'm showing you here is the essential stuff, the absolute minimum you need to know. But remember, the more you learn, the better. Okay, there is a bit of padding always in the full list. And if you're paying close attention in the vocabulary of this unit, you might even spot a repeated word. If you find it, drop it in the comments. I also want to warn you about a few common mistakes. I often hear people using Spanglish and saying things like inigualdad, but the word you want is desigualdad. Similarly, watch your pronunciation with marginación. I'm going to repeat for those in the back. Marginación. There are also two similar nouns that often get mixed up. La pena, which means your sentence or punishment, and la penalización, which is a penalty. And a quick reminder on false friends: to apply for something is solicitar, not aplicar. I also don't quite agree with how your textbook translates polemizar. In the context we're looking at, it's much better to say to stir up controversy. You might already know that tachar means to cross out, but it also means to brand someone as something. Just remember, it's always followed by the preposition de, tachar de. Finally, a classic trap. Casualmente has nothing to do with casualties. It actually means by chance. And that's all for today. If you found this video helpful, sometimes I do wonder if I'm just talking to myself here, please hit the like button and subscribe. Nos vemos en el próximo video. Venga, hasta luego.